Obviously, a question which those who have a mind to are making at the present moment is not just where is God in this situation that we're all living in, but is this God's judgment? Or even is this God's punishment? Now, there's no doubt whatsoever for anybody who reads the Bible that words like judgment and punishment are always to be considered in this universe which God has created. And although that might seem offensive to our postmodern cultural thinking, it is a reality. It all depends where you begin. If you begin with us, with our thinking, with our cultural situation, with our history, with our rationalism, then that's one position. But if you begin with God, who is almighty, eternal, unchanging, holy, just, God is love, then we submit to what God's will is. But following our consideration of how do we become more serious Christians, how do we take this more seriously, which is an extremely important consideration. Let's just consider for a moment, if not punishment and judgment, how can we take God's discipline seriously? Because that is equally clear in Scripture, that God is interested in our sanctification, which is far more than making us good people. Justification is one thing. Sanctification is what God is doing after we have been justified. And it means basically we've been set apart to live as God's people. And God's people have a checkered history, both in the post-time of Christ and the pre-time of Christ. If we go to Deuteronomy chapter 8, we will find a classic description of God's discipline in the experience of God's people when they spent 40 years in the desert after not entering into the promised land. And Moses says this to the people of Israel: "You shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness." Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 2 onwards. You shall remember. Remember why? Because we forget. You and I every morning must come back to Scripture. Otherwise we forget. You shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness. God didn't abandon them any more than he has abandoned his people now. He leads us. God is sovereign. God is totally in control. And in the desperate situations that people have lived through, there is always God leading them. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff protect me. Led you these 40 years in the wilderness. It wasn't even 40 days or 40 months. When God disciplines, it's serious. And we can't enter into it thinking in our postmodern terms of instant gratification. He led you these 40 years in the wilderness that he might humble you, the basis of wrong thinking and the root of sin is pride, especially in the obvious nature of pride, which is self-sufficiency, ignoring the fact that I am totally dependent on my Creator, on God. He led them those 40 years in the wilderness that he might humble them, just as he wants to humble us, to empty us of self-sufficiency, to think that we can. The minute you move away from any sense of self-sufficiency, you're on much safer ground. And not just self-sufficiency, self-satisfaction. And he allows us to face self-satisfaction by letting us hunger. Because if you're not hungry, you will have no interest whatsoever in the things of God. And in the desert, you get hungry. Today we are full of so many secondary, not to use any other word, things. And so we're not hungry. So here we are in the desert. And those with a mind to know God are suffering hunger. Why does he allow us to suffer hunger? So that he might give us the food that we don't know. And the food that we don't know is just like the manna in the wilderness. And the word manna means, what's this? Because we don't get it, we don't know it, we do not know the things that God has for us. Let you hunger and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. God has spoken. What is the basis of your thinking? But in order to be able to be humbled and to be hungry, we need to have some kind of self-awareness. So he led you those 40 years in the wilderness, testing you to know what was in your heart. How do you know what's in your heart? Going in the wilderness. Then you will find out what you are really like. That's why Christ prayed in the garden, I'm not praying that you take them out of the world, because so many people have thought by going out of the world into whatever way they interpret that, they will escape evil. Believe me, evil is closer to me than the place I'm living in. And I need to know that. I need to know what's in my heart. All that glitters is not gold. All that believes is not faith. And we need to know that. I had a brother-in-law who was a mechanic in the Royal Air Force. And once the pilot whose aeroplane he was preparing said, everything done? Yes, sir. Yes, I've done full service. Well, you get in the back of the aeroplane and we'll go up and do a few acrobatics. Ah, well, sir, just give me a couple more hours. Are you prepared to let God test you to see the state of your heart? And believe me, nobody trusts God unless there is no other alternative. Just think of Moses on the banks of the Red Sea. They'd got out of Egypt. He'd completed his task. Everybody slept that night after a wonderful party on the banks of the Red Sea. But the next morning, as they got up, they saw the dust in the distance and realized that somebody was coming, and it was Pharaoh's army. And they complained to Moses, and he went and complained to God and said, what am I going to do? And God said, you go forward, you go on. And Moses said, yeah, but what about the water? And God said, you just go to the banks and lift your staff up, and I will deal with the water. But believe me, the only reason Moses stood on the banks of the Red Sea and raised his staff was because there was no other alternative. So let's take God's discipline seriously and let's grow and mature. God bless you.